Recording in progress. Do you want to come up to the front then? Oh, yeah. Right.
You can see what I can sit here.
Just so you can get. Okay.
Yeah.
Hello, my house being with you. Thank you.
We played the article being Randall. Successful. I thought, well, it's really well.
It is, yes. Grecian refugees. So the dongle is here.
So that's the single, right? And we'll change the buttons.
It's not working. Sometimes you need to click, but still. This is not working.
Let's check the side.
Yeah. It's like it's a little bit loose on this side, but I think the contact is so good. It's no problem.
Yeah. That's those fresh batteries, not like I get to.
Yeah, these are fresh.
Yeah.
They're good.
There we go. That should be right now.
Let's check it.
Yeah. Maybe the socket is that one. Maybe we change a different socket. Can we?
Yeah, we can. Let me see.
Just trying all the stability.
Yeah, of course.
Not yet. Is it always being inside the computer?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we can change it here. I don't think it will
This
make a
is
difference.
No, because if it was, so you found that, that's good.
Yeah. So, but it's okay though. I mean, I'll take care of it, but it's just that
No,
it
but
would
we
need to be checked.
that.
And
Yeah.
fixed. There's an issue. Was it when was it used for last night?
I don't know. I'm not.
Okay.
So I don't know.
Okay. No worries. No worries. I'll take care of it.
Yeah. You got next round.
Yes, yes, you are.
He's decided. Okay, yeah. Yeah,
Okay. Unusual peacekeeping position.
Alvin,
Yep.
I get you a new one. If you wanna,
Yeah, sure. Well, brand new, huh?
yeah, so. Hopefully, once that's will be,
Does he have a battery? No,
no, we're gonna have to swap the battery,
it's all right.
but if it's
Are we
works.
okay with the parkway completion?
Yes, I mean, if
Then it
if
was
this will not
exactly-
work, I doubt it that it will not work, but if it will not work, then I'll take care of it. It's okay. Oops.
You would like always to hear someone, no problem, but there's always
Like,
one
oh,
thing,
and then last minute,
there's
there's
always
one
one
thing,
thing,
yeah.
there's always one thing, it's incredible,
Listen,
isn't it? But we have the,
Last week, we didn't have a sound, you know.
Yeah.
that. Alban,
Yeah.
that was disappointing.
Okay, this is-
Okay.
It could be the receiver.
No, it's just the message.
no,
It's the receiver.
what do you mean the receiver,
It's this, it's the dongle.
we changed that one, we have the new one here,
Yeah, no, it's-
no, here, look. So if you take that off,
Oh, yeah. Oh, is that, okay. Oh, interesting.
I know,
Oh, that's good.
there you go,
Good.
what pins that?
Yeah.
That is the cover for the old one, so the new one, so that's even
Okay.
better.
Good.
You off people
This
one,
one.
okay.
Where's the previous one? That, I think, wait,
Sorry,
then I guess that's a USB. Let me double check that. Because I don't think it's. Wireless control and laser.
that's not,
Yeah,
so probably could be works,
could you?
okay.
There we go. So I guess, but this is also a remote control dongle. But I don't know what it is used for. It's so good.
So that,
So the old one is good.
the old one should be good.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean,
it's all right,
yeah.
so, doesn't matter, anyway, so,
it's the wrong dongle. Sorry about
yeah,
that.
it's all right.
Yeah.
I am around next week, yes.
You keep the new one.
That's, which one is the new, I think this is.
Yeah.
Is the new?
Yes.
Okay, I cover. Just check as well, yeah, it's fine.
No. Oh, oops.
Can I bring the speaker?
Sorry?
Can I bring the speaker?
Yeah, sure. Yes, I think this.
I guess he was best with the old one.
No, hold on a second, because I think we swapped. No, keep it.
Yeah.
I think we'll swap this. It must be. You don't need to cover it for now, just until we start.
No, because I mean, okay, because the dongle is the problem.
Yeah, no, it's related.
The old one.
Yeah, everything relates to its own thing, I
Yeah.
think.
All right, and do you want to keep this here? Do you want to take it back? It's really up to you.
No,
It
just
used to be
leave that
here.
there, just leave that there.
Okay, good. Oh, good.
Yeah.
Hi, Catherine. How are you?
Thank you. Ask me to have slides.
Yes, it's this one's. Do you know who is going to present?
Yes.
Okay, and here's the slides, right?
He emailed them through.
Okay, are you using the presentation, correct?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you can use the clicker and you can point it to this laptop
Okay.
because the dongle is here.
Okay, that's.
But after I'll share it.
Okay.
I'll share the screen and then you can go ahead after.
Okay, but I won't see it in advance. I'll have to.
No,
I'll see here.
you'll see that,
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you.
Welcome everybody to our Tuesday seminar at the European Studies Center. And it is a great pleasure to have Professor Randall Hansen as our speaker today on migration. And it's also a great joy for us to welcome again Randall, because he's got a long Oxford background, I understand. With lots of affiliations with lots of colleges. He's currently visiting an academic at Munk College, yes. And he is will be talking to us about his current book, which he is preparing now, which is called Dreaming of Europe, Refugees and the Old Continent, which is similar to the title that we have today. And Randall is a research chair in Immigration and Governance Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the University of Toronto. And Margaret Macmillan is here as well as a college patron from Toronto too, and the interim director of the Munk School for Global Affairs. And he's written a long list of books. His CV is on the website of American College of Law. And he will be talking about 40 minutes on this topic. And as a discussant for 5-7 minutes is our very own Briddick, who is Andrew Mellon Associate Professor of International Human Rights and Refugee Law. That's one of the laws, we said to write it down. And we're looking forward to your presentation, 40 minutes and 5 minutes with Catherine, who will have a question and answer.
Great. Well, thank you, Othon. Thank you for the kind introduction. Great to be back in Oxford. Great to see some old friends and some new ones. And this really came out of a conversation that I had with Tim when he presented something in Toronto, and Tim's always been a great friend of the University of Toronto. And I told him I was writing a book on refugees, and he said, well, I'm interested in solutions. Can you come give a talk in Oxford? So setting a very low bar indeed, not a challenging task. I will do my best to rise to it. But I want to begin with 3 vignettes. And the first is about Kesey, a young Malian man in his early 20s who fled the Civil War in 2017, making his way first to Libya. He worked in Tripoli for 9 months as a day laborer, making a pittance, and then for over 3 for a smuggler in exchange for passage to Italy. He got on a boat, but did not get far. He began taking on water. The Libyan Coast Guard retrieved him, and he was sent to a prison run by a criminal syndicate. He was forced to work as a day laborer in the community. His wages were stolen at the end of every day. He was then sold as a slave for someone else. He labored for months for free, and at the end of all, out of pity or for some other reason, he was put on a boat. The journey to Italy was treacherous. 6 people drowned, including his closest friends. But when he arrived, he said the difference between Libya and Italy was between hell and heaven. The Italians were kind. They gave him food and clothing. They put him on a bus to Milan and he secured refugee status and is now working as a sailor. In Rome, there's a young Cameroonian woman I spoke to who came to Italy with the only father she had ever known, but fled when, suspecting she was gay, he became abusive and violent. She sought asylum, got it, and started at the very bottom of the labor market, working in terrible jobs for about 900 euro a month. She applied for dozens of others. Emails and calls, however, went unanswered. She had run into a wall of structural racism. The reply, when there was one, was, "I'm sorry, the position is just filled." The director of the refugee center, where she lived in a room 5-1 and was woken up by frequent fights, however, told her not to give up, and eventually she secured an internship, an apprenticeship in a bed and breakfast. She wants more from life and hopes to study further, but for it all, she's happy in Italy. No one cares, she said, if I'm gay here. And finally, Urbani is a young Nigerian in Calabria, a Christian in the northern portions of the country. He was persecuted for his religion. One night, the police broke into his house and shot his father in front of him. His father's dying words were, "You have to leave." He took his sister, fled to a nearby small town, tried to hide there, but they were set upon by thugs who tried to gang rape his sister. He fought them off, but was stabbed in the stomach. He then made it with help to the capital, and a cousin there said, "We can get to Italy via Libya. I have a friend there." They went to the friend, gave him the money. The friend was a trafficker. They were sold as slaves. The 2 men into forced labor, the sister into sexual slavery. One of the guards in the prison camp, finding out he was 16, took pity on him, said, "You're too young for this," put him on a boat to Italy. He's applying for asylum there. He's heard nothing from his sister. I start with these stories, 3 of many, because I will present a lot of numbers. And it's easy to forget, even before the tabloids in this country start comparing refugees to at best thieves and at worst to sewage. It's easy to forget that we are talking about people whom any one of us in this room could have been had the accidents of birth been different. Now, it's often said, this comes out of a manuscript in progress. And the method is inductive and interview-based. And I really have three goals. One is to understand, insofar as I can, given my, to use a trendy term, positionality, the refugee crisis from the perspective of refugees. To explore the refugee work nexus, coming out of some recent work I've done on labor, and above all, cheap migrant labor, and to outline, in a rather crowded field, solutions. And the stakes here are very high indeed, because these vultures want to destroy democracy. And immigration is the anchor of their arguments, and they are, frankly and sadly, winning. Ipsos polling shows that 51% of Europeans believe that the EU is bad for immigration. Only 16% think it's good. So we simply have to try to get this right. Now let's step back and look at the big picture, and that is rising numbers year on year. About 20 million throughout the glorious 1990s, and then from the Iraq War, moving up and up and up, now a historical high of about 110 million internally displaced asylum seekers and refugees. And the reasons are quite simple: war and persecution in that order. Fully 52% from Syria, from Afghanistan, and from Ukraine. Sudan is another major sending country, also wrapped by war. War has long overtaken persecution as the fundamental driver of refugee flows. And the West bears much responsibility. The 2001 to 2021 war in Afghanistan, spending $2 trillion and ending up where we started, except that tens of thousands of people were dead and hundreds of thousands had fled. The 2003 illegal attack on Iraq, and above all, into my eternal shame, I thought it was a good idea at the time, the 2011 destruction of Gaddafi's regime, which turned Libya, which had been a place of migration and opportunity for sub-Saharan Africans, into a torture camp, and which at the same time destabilized the entire Sahel region, which has had 9 coups from Captain Grant in the last 3 years. So we bear responsibility, but so, of course, does another significant power, Russia. Obviously, for Ukraine, but also the Soviet Union for the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. In that quotation there isn't the president of Libya by Kizzi, that was a political scientist explanation of the refugee crisis from the young Taylor. We destroyed the institutions. Now, a bit of perspective here. Europe, as the refugee scholars in the room will certainly know, is not the main region hosting refugees, and it never has been. Fully 75% of them are in the global south, countries like Iran, Turkey, Colombia, Pakistan, Uganda. Until the Ukrainian flight, it was 86%. So the only country in the West that is pulling its weight in the acceptance of refugees is the Federal Republic of Germany. And frankly, it never has. If we look at, this is a chart on refugee stocks. These are the global south. These are high income countries. It's always been a very, very short line. And forgive the plug, but you see that from the mid-1970s, this line goes up and up and up, comes down a little bit, and then back up again after Iraq. The argument in my most recent book is that the OPEC oil crisis reconfigured the global economy and geopolitics in a manner that generated well over 100 million pounds. So the West is not, Europe is not doing the major part of the work here, but it's doing more than other rich countries. And I thought I included a chart there, but I guess you can make it through. But what you look here, if you see, this is total high-income country stocks of refugees. The EU is about 2/3, Germany again leading, and the bar line showing the United States in Europe shows that the United States has a fraction of the world's refugees. The European, I thought it included it, but check it. Now, the distribution across Europe, again, Germany at the top, these are applications in 2023, then France, then Italy, and these are older slides, I sent in some new ones, but it seems to not hold it up, but I can take you through it. Then little Austria, then the UK. And Germany has a particularly powerful appeal for refugees. In all the interview work I did, the promised land for refugees is Germany, then Canada, then the United States. And we could talk about why. It's partly the Merkel effect. Angela Merkel, the chancellor here, let go for the first time. How long was she chancellor for? 17 years? 16. In her 16 years as chancellor, she let go once here and had this self-taken, regretted it, forget her. It was partly the Merkel effect, but also Germany's broader soft power appeal. So, a bit more perspective. Most migration within Europe is of Europeans. So in 2019, 70% of the stock of migrants in Germany was made up of other Europeans, Africans that get all the attention, a paltry 3.6%. So when we talk about these highly politicized refugee and asylum seeker flows, let's never forget we're talking about a small number of people, and overstayers massively exceed the number of asylum seekers. So in the United States in 2022, there were 250,000 asylum applications, 253,000. This is very, very bad for Biden politically. In that year, there were 850,000 overstayers. In Spain, Latin Americans coming on a tourist visa and not going home vastly exceed any other migrants, including refugees. Now, the question that's often asked, are all asylum seekers refugees? And the answer is no. The flows are hopelessly mixed, and many are economic migrants, a term that is not popular with the left. But that determination, economic migrant versus refugee, can only be made after adjudication. It is not made on the boats or before the boats arrive. So the description by, above all, Sunak and the Conservative, but also Keith Starmer, of migrants coming on the boats across the channel as illegal migrants is completely incorrect, or at the very least, highly premature. Because if you're a legitimate refugee, it doesn't matter how you come, on a boat with a smuggler, in the back of a lorry, underneath a car. Dangerous, to be sure, but perfectly legal. And again, the legality is determined by the adjudication process. And that said, given that flows are so mixed, it is hard to know the balance between economic migrants and refugees, but broad patterns obtain. And if we look at this is the list of the major refugee-producing countries, and this is the recognition rate. And if we look here, Afghanistan 70%, Syria 90%, Somalia 65%, Iran also high, 38%. Ukraine, we could add, they're dealt with through temporary protection, so formally outside of the refugee adjudication process, but 100%. And if we look at the overall recognition rate across the European Union, it is 44%, the highest in 6 years. If we add the Ukrainians, I'm sure that tops 50%. So a strong plurality or a majority of asylum seekers coming to the EU and Britain are refugees. So is that. But these refugees are not getting all the attention. There was 1.1 million people who applied for asylum in the EU last year. The ones that get the attention are the 157,000 who come across the Mediterranean on boats. And they come mostly from West Africa, some from Syria, a few from Pakistan, a few from Mali, and a few are from Sudan. And I'll come back to those countries because they matter. And what that means is that the crisis, the refugee crisis, is overly focused on a relatively small number of arrivals. Anytime anyone asks me about the migration crisis, they all want to talk about Lampedusa. It is those arriving by boat, above all, much more so than the Canary Islands for some reason. We contrast this rhetoric, this division, this argument, this bitterness over a small number of people with 6 million Ukrainians. Dealt with quickly through the temporary protection framework, cross EU mobility and work rights were respected. The groups aren't perfectly comparable. In a sense, in the Ukrainian refugee crisis, Europe was behaving or experiencing what the global itself experiences all the time. A war, massive fly-in out, and massive influx in neighboring countries. Because when you're a refugee, you run until you no longer have to run. And that is the country next door. If you get out, most people are displaced. And Europe hasn't seen this since the Balkan Wars of the early 1990s, but really not since the early post-war period, when 13 million Germans were expelled, for example. Racism certainly plays a role in differentiating the approach to West African asylum seekers or Syrian asylum seekers and Ukrainians, but also policy choice and politicization. I believe the research shows that when politicians lead public opinion on immigration and refugees, they can turn the argument. I just published a piece going back to 1972, looking at the conservatives and the Ugandan Asians who were expelled by Idi Amin at the start of the crisis. 6% of Britons wanted them to come. After a month in which the Tories, to their credit, emphasized that they were refugees, technically they were citizens, but that's not quibble. They were refugees. Amin was a monster. They were going to suffer. That figure went from 6% to over 50%. So this crisis is, in a large measure, constructed. However, a constructed crisis is still a crisis. And it's further complicated by non-return. The difficulty for European countries, and Manley disclose, and Matthew Gibney and I wrote about that 20 years ago, is that almost no one whose asylum application is rejected is returned. Either because they simply disappear in formality, as you would, they'd like get the hell out of there, or it's impossible to get agreement, a bilateral agreement, or the airlines refuse to take them, a whole series of reasons, but return basically does not happen. What Matthew Gibney and I argued then is we have to understand that the great illiberalism at the border is partly a function of illiberalism within the border, the non-function of returns. Right, so how do we get out of this crisis? Well, were I a therapist, and I've seen a few over the years, I would recommend 2 things: acceptance and action. Accept. We need to accept that migration is normal and inevitable, that Europe, above all, needs migrants, that multiple sectors, meatpacking, construction, logistics, hospitality, gardening, home care, the health service, these would collapse without cheap labor and cheap migrant labor. And part of the ongoing disaster that is Brexit, you are seeing a slice of what the EU would look like without migrants. Shortages of key workers across all sectors. Immigration has been essential to raising standards of living for the middle class since their wages stagnated after Othon in the 1970s, and is essential to the quality of life of everyone in it's really tough. Now, act. A constructed crisis partly requires a constructed solution, and that means the creation of a perception of control. Only a perception, you never actually have control. Where publics feel that the government has lost control of borders, support for immigration collapses. You may cite that as Hansen's law, because I am confident in it. This happened in Germany during the Balkan refugee crisis. This happened in Britain in 2000. This happened in the United States in the 1990s. And now it's happening Germany in 2015, on and on and on. And a US study showed that even when you tell people you're spending more on border control, without actually doing it, without any evidence that makes any difference, support for immigration increases. The perception of control is crucial. And the best way to get there is by opening formal channels. Hardly the first person saying this, but it is true. Now, legal routes means two things. It means humanitarian routes for refugees, because you can't get to Europe to apply for asylum. What I'm talking about here is more routes for migrant workers. Open the labor market to people who are currently in the asylum queues, because there's no other way of getting to Europe. And the question is, will this work? Will this make a difference? And I think it will. Again, remember that the boats are causing the crisis. And if we look at the numbers in the boats in the Mediterranean Sea, not in the Channel, Guinea, Tunisia, Ivory Coast, Bangladesh, the top four, almost 50%. Those are basically economic migrants. Egypt, ditto. Then we get some refugees, Pakistan, economic migrants, and then some mixed flows. But the majority, and West Africans, I did a bunch of field work there, happily admit that the people who are leaving are doing so for economic opportunities. If we open routes for these people, get them off the boats, that will keep people from dying in the sea, and hopefully address this constructive crisis. Now, I've said this, but they are basically there because there are no formal channels for them. They cannot apply for work permits. Visa applications are very long, and they're generally, when they apply, rejected. When I did my field work, the bitterness among West Africans about EU, European countries' visa policy was absolutely palatable. Palpable. Sorry, I'm going to tell you. Types of channels, again, work permits linked with labor market demand. And I have this from Hein de Haas, with a right to remain, and a right to go back, and a right to return. It's an odd quirk of human nature that if you have a choice between staying and leaving permanently, you will always stay. If you're allowed to leave and come back, you're more likely to leave, and you probably won't come back. This was true in 1962, when the Beat the Ban rush came just before the Commonwealth Immigration Act. The Get Worker Stops in 1973 failed. So create labor permits that allow circulation. Temporary migration and agriculture. It sounds like a contradiction, but it's not. Agriculture is seasonal. It's work that Europeans don't want to do. West Africans in particular could be brought on temporary contracts and then go back again. And it's controversial, but Canada has a massive model, hundreds of thousands in temporary agriculture, and the rotation principle. There are some human rights abuses, but the rotation principle seems to work. More study and scholarship applications for Africans in the EU. They will tend to concentrate in France and perhaps in Germany. So ideally, the EU would pay for this to compensate for that. That would skill up those individuals. Hopefully they would return, even if they didn't, help their own countries. Even if they didn't, it's better than skimming off those educated at African countries' expense. And leverage all of this for cooperation on returns. Because North African and West African countries will not budget returns unless they're buy off with serious amounts of cash or there's movement on visas and permits. And all of this is less morally suspect and probably cheaper than handing billions to the teams. I also recommend tackling the demand side. Regularize informal migrants because they are not going home. And the longer they're informal, the more that they are exploited. If we really want skilled, fewer low-skilled workers, make low-skilled work better paid. Improve the conditions for low-skilled work. Ensure that minimum wages are paid in all sectors, and make workplace inspections, which are probably too rare anyway, focus not on ID cards, but on working conditions and salaries. If we do this, however, it will have inflationary consequences because we're all living on the back of cheap migrant labor, and that might get enforced. So this might have to be linked with these sectoral minimum incomes, effectively using the tax system to subsidize cheap work, cheap labor, and cheap products for all of us. Tackle the supply side. Now, the first one is easy, stop launching stupid wars. When other people talk about tackling the supply side, like Keir Starmer, what they talk about is going after and ripping up, his favorite word, ripping up the traffickers. And this is tempting and politically appealing because it creates a perfect villain and a perfect and rather manly hero who's going to go in and bust them up. Completely misconceive the nature of the problem and the likelihood of a solution. Many of these traffickers are small fry, sometimes they're family members, or they're simple fishermen. So this picture here, I took near my hotel in Dakar, and it's tipped off that these fishermen are being paid to take people to the Canary Islands. It's about a 9-hour journey. So ethnographic research means ethnographic research. I went there and looked. So I went there and looked, tried a great little methodological sophistication. And sure enough, you had all these boats and a series of young, the back of the picture, you just might pick them up, young West African men, not all Senegalese, just looking to board. Now, rather than ripping up the trafficking efforts, which won't work. Oh yeah, actually one more comment on that. There are, of course, horrible traffickers in the desert who do unspeakable things. When you bust them up, though, you don't stop the trafficking. You break up the network, it decentralizes, and it reforms with smaller groups who, according to IOM, are even more brutal. What we should rather do is invest in education. And this ties to the development debate. This used to be an easy one. We thought if you want to stop migration, slow it down, invest in the development of sending countries. And then a series of clever dicks came along and said, no, this won't work. Because as countries get richer, people have more money, they're more likely to migrate. Philip Martin, Eric Solberg, climbed the path. There's something to this. A migration hump can be created, as it was in Mexico after NAFTA. But I think the evidence is much more mixed than people suggest. And in interviews with NGOs in Guinea, in Senegal, in the Ivory Coast, in Morocco, you might say, well, they're paid by us to say these things. Equally importantly, interviewed with migrants and refugees, potential and return ones in those countries, they all agreed that a lack of opportunity was a reason for leaving. If they had opportunity, they would stay. Now, we also, I think, need to work with NGOs and the communities, not the governments, to highlight the very real dangers of the route, the realities of migrant life in Europe. Very often people come, the whole community has put together money for them. The hopes of a village are on their shoulders. They arrive, they fail, they're working a terrible job, they're in sex work. Well, what do? They do what I did when I was in Abidjan, having a very good life. I sent these pictures home. Koki, which is basically the Beverly Hills of Abidjan. My friend said, "This is amazing. I haven't been." Well, this is Abidjan. Well, that's not the picture I sent home. So they sent home on their phones pictures of them standing in front of a big house on the Champs-Élysées, where they imply they live, cafes in the 7th arrondissement, and it gives a completely false impression of Europe. Right, gotta speed up. That's it for economic economic migrants. What do we do with refugees? Well, we make it clear that most asylum seekers are coming to Europe, and they're legitimate refugees, and process them. It is simple as that. Stop expending all this energy and this political capital entering the far right, an argument with the far right, which you will lose. Demonizing asylum seekers, process them efficiently and quickly. And then I come back to the recognition rates. Most are refugees. Now, offshore processing. This is a slightly dirty word in migration circles, processing applications after they cross the border, but not yet in Europe. This does not mean Rwanda, which is a farce, and an expensive farce. And Alistair Campbell's right, it's performative cruelty. What it means is expanding resettlements. And Canada, and I don't know very much about Canada. I try to remain ignorant. It's difficult within Toronto, you don't think of someone. So I'm not an expert on Canada. However, if Canada can process 40,000 per year, there's no reason why other countries cannot do the same. And I'll hold that point because it's related to the next one. I think something we seriously need to think about is rescue at sea to keep people from dying and process them on European shores, which would require a time of detention. If this is done under decent conditions, if there's massive investment in reception centers, if there are cross EU standards, I don't see why this wouldn't work. Not the hotspots approach, where you crowd them into unsanitary, dangerous reception areas, often on the centers, with the hope that you'll distribute across Europe, but something very different. And that takes us to the EU agreement. Now, this is hated by the far left and the right, which instinctively tells me it must have a thing or two in its favor. And it gets a couple of things right, I think. It gives up on Dublin, on this fiction that we are going to shuttle people across the continent, forcing people back to the first country they reached. It's never worked. It enforces solidarity via payments. And I kind of like this because this respects state agency and refugee agency. Poles and Hungarians and Czechs don't want refugees, and the feeling is warmly reciprocated. But the refugees do not want to be here. So rather than forcing them to countries that they'll probably leave for Germany anyway as soon as they can, much better to tax these countries and to pay for their integration into Germany, into France, or whatever. However, a big however, it will not work if the other measures, legalization, opening routes, rescue at sea, and better work conditions are not in place, and they are not. I'll go through stopping the boats very quickly, but the key point here, the key takeaway here is that this crisis is utterly constructed because the countries that they come from are the reverse of the countries they come from 2 years ago. Most of them are from Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and Albania, which has now been blocked. Those people on the channel are legitimate refugees and should be processed. And those who have been processed, 86% fraud, a grant of protection. So I'll wind up. Yes, that was the last slide.
I think it's, let me check. It should have been it. This is it, conclusion, right?
Yeah, sorry.
I think you maybe went too fast.
Yeah, that might have been my general insight. Sorry about that. So, conclusion, schaffen wir das? Translated as will we manage this? But I think the better translation of what Merkel meant was the American, we've got this. Have we got this? Well, migration and refugee flows are not going anywhere. They result from the demands of Europe's demographics, its economies, and from geopolitics. If anything, they will increase. The current control-based approach is a disaster. It's not working, and tens of thousands of people are dying. So I suggest we take a page out of the German book. 2015 was the most extraordinary thing I saw in 25 years of observing and living in Germany. Because the Germans are pessimistic. The usual response to a crisis or a problem in Germany, in the press, in the articles, on the talk shows is, this is bad, it's going to get worse, and there's nothing we can do about it. I advise my German students to make up the structure of their articles if they want a successful academic career in journalism. The Germans here said, Merkel led and said, there's nothing we can do about this. They are coming, let's make this work, and by God. So that's what we need at the EU level. A fundamental transformation of the narrative, as well as the implementation of all of these policies. Because none of them alone, opening groups, awareness campaign, development measures, search and rescue, processing interception centers, none of them will work unless they were all. And are we certain that they work? No, or most certainly not. Because what we have to try. Because only if we try are we going to see off the far right with their toxic cocktail of lies and racism. Only if we try are we going to save tens of thousands of people dying in agony on the seas and in the desert. And only if we try are we going to save yourselves, dare I, the British passport say, ourselves. Only then are we going to save a Europe that I think we love, a Europe of values, a Europe of rights, and a Europe of refuge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Randall, for this excellent mapping, but also lots of recommendations as well. I should have said from the beginning that you are also consulting the International Organization for Migration, the United Nations Commissioners for Refugees, the World Bank. So there's a lot of you in there in terms of recommending. Lots of things there. We will ask Catherine. I mean, my main question is how do you make Europeans think like Germans? But that's something that you probably can tell us later. Catherine.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to comment on this paper and this book. I think to conclude that so much of what you say is common sense and is to belie both the sophistication of your own research and the research of those who you draw on to pull these arguments together. I have some areas of agreement. I have some related areas of pushback, and I have one question, if that's anything. So I'm going to start with the agreement. So I agree with you in terms of what the stakes are here and how you frame that in terms of European fundamental rights, but also in terms of fundamental values. I don't think the threat, however, to those comes from the populist far-right organizations and political parties and movements which you identify. Certainly that is one area that we should be concerned about. But I think one of the things that I find more concerning are the responses in war and in politics to those movements. And I just want to give two examples of that now, one from the UK and one from Europe. So just before Christmas, the UK Supreme Court ruled that removing protection seekers to Rwanda to have their claims determined there breached the Refugee Convention because Rwanda was not a safe country. And almost immediately afterwards, the British government moved legislation in order to legislate the fiction, or indeed the falsehood, that Rwanda was a safe country, essentially passing a law to say that black was white. Now, this type of move within the UK and its very long constitutional history is absolutely unprecedented. And when you framed the problem in terms of democratic values, I think any substantive conception of democracy has to include the rule of law. And legislative moves like that in the UK and allied agreements in other European countries undercut the rule of law in ways that are much more damaging, I think, than the results that we might be seeing in European parliamentary elections over the next few months. I suppose it's not what they're going to do to us, what we're going to do to ourselves first, before they even get rid of it. And at the European level, I think there's a real rule of law issue around Frontex and its operations. I was really heartened to see your comments around search and rescue. I think at the moment, Frontex as an organization is operating in a lacuna of impunity. One where its actions are not being subject to legal processes, even though we have quite significant evidence at this point that they are contributing to migrant drownings and incidents where individuals lose their lives and are returned to situations which are unsafe. And yet, because Frontex is both a creature of the EU and of states, we don't have the mechanism to hold individuals at all levels within Frontex legally responsible or indeed politically accountable for those actions. So I agree with you on the stakes, but I would reframe that a little, I think, to encompass threats to the rule of law that have nothing to do with some of the populist movements that you identify or generated in response to. I also agree that this is a crisis that is constructive. And so the question is, I suppose, then, how do we know that? And the example you gave of Ukraine, I think, is very apt for a number of reasons. So what the activation of the Temporary Protection Directive does is gives us two responses to situations which oftentimes mass influx situations, situations where a lot of people are seeking international protection at the same time. And those two responses are first, mobility, and second, sanctuary. So mobility was given through a directive that enabled people, as you identified in the paper, to move within EU states. So some could stay at a border area in Poland and did the movement exactly that you described, of returning home and then leaving, because when people have choice, they can do that. But some moved further afield within the common European asylum system and were able to reunite with family. And when I say sanctuary, here I'm referring to the rights restoring status that temporary protection provides. Because it didn't just provide protection from deportation or being shuttled around different EU states. It enabled people to work, and not just in some of the low-skilled areas that you identified, it enabled them to work in any area of the economy, to go to school, to reunite with family members. So with the response to those displaced from Ukraine, we can see what the opposite of a crisis is. We can see what good governance and sound legal responses can provide. I also agree that the majority of the people that we're talking about are refugees. And I agree that so much of policy, debates and dialogue are constructed around the fiction of a boat that is approaching these shores, a boat which has people in it. And we don't think that all of them, or even a majority of them, or even any of them, are refugees. And so because of this kind of deployment of the boat in different types of argument, whether legal or other, we foreclose the possibility that people are in need of protection, and we reroute our arguments accordingly. And in terms of the recognition rates, I just wanted to add that you were drawing on Eurostat figures, I think, here, but the UK's recognition rates are much higher, sorry. So we're looking at over 75% recognition of refugees in the UK, and we top things like 98 and 99% quarter by quarter with people from Afghanistan, Eritrea, and the European nationalities that you identified. So I think that just confirms, I think, the arguments that you make. And I also agree that illegality is generated by lots of different labour migration routes that put people in situations which are precarious, where they cannot renew their status, and therefore they're pushed into, for example, the black market. They're unable to regularize and work lawfully. So I think there's much that I found really interesting and engaging here. I think I have some areas of pushback, and some of them you will have to see. So the first I think is not a legal argument, it's more of not even an ethical argument, it's something that looks a bit like it. And it's how you frame your response to the problem. And so one of the things you say is that European states, global war states, are responsible for the different types of war and broader structural inequalities that cause people that have to leave their homes. And I would agree with you. I think we can probably all agree that not waging illegal wars is a good way of ensuring that refugees are not created. But then the response, or one of the responses at least, that you seem to offer here, and we're only getting a snapshot of your work, very obviously, is one that's almost instrumental. It's not a reparative response to wrongdoing, it's a recognise refugees because they're great for the economy. And I don't think that there's necessarily a conflict there, but I think that there's something that needs to be explored in terms of what makes a response reparative to wrongdoing. Now in law, we know what that is because we have mentioned the name. So we know that something is reparative of wrongdoing when it involves acknowledging it, apologising, putting forward a remedy, giving compensation, and taking together this package has to be reparative of the wrong that you are concerned with. And it doesn't seem to me that some of the short-term labour migration routes that you identify or offshore processing, which I will come back to, fits any or all of those approaches to the wrongs that we might be concerned with. I think another question I had about the framing of this is the dichotomy between protection routes on the one hand and labour migration on the other. And I can see how the numbers that you give us kind of point to those things as being kind of common sense ways of approaching the problem. And in some ways it falls within the trap that I mentioned earlier, the people who see the boat coming and demonstrate or make a decision of who's on it and calibrate their responses in response to it. Because you seem to be saying on the basis of the numbers we have, we know that these groups of people are not refugees. And so therefore we can funnel them appropriately in different ways, either to the labour market or to a detention centre to have their claim determined quickly. So I think there's a potential for circularity there. And I think there is also the danger of embedding the dichotomy that it is either protection or labour migration. And I think the response to Ukraine tells us that it's not a choice, it's not an either or. Because as I mentioned, the sanctuary that was offered by the Temporary Protection Directive was the right to work. So we can do both of those things at the same time without getting overly concerned about which nationalities have which kind of level of acceptance. I would also say, you get a tri-feminist point whenever I speak, that those stats are not generally disaggregated. So some of the nationalities you're referring to have incredibly high rates of recognition, either for women's claims in the basis of gender-based violence or LGBT cases which are related to the statutory job. I also want to push back on the Dublin doesn't work point. I think there are two ways.
Defend Dublin.
Sorry?
You're going to defend Dublin. I think that sounds
I agree with you that states need the illusion of control, and I don't know that there's always a different actually. I think we should be on that more. But Dublin gave the illusion of control, both to states and to populations, because it told people that people would be returned to the first country that they realised asylum. So even if it didn't do that in the vast majority of cases, there was a mechanism that could be pointed to in relation to her district defence. Now, I don't think that that's a particularly good argument. I think the stronger argument is the right argument. So the UK had to enter into a migration and economic partnership with Rwanda because we could no longer, following Brexit, return people to the EU. And for whatever legal reason, I think it's part of the one that's significant, the UK would not negotiate a returns agreement with the EU as a whole. It only sought to negotiate agreements with individually with states, and we weren't able to reach them, perhaps unsurprisingly, we weren't willing to pay enough. So Dublin is the reason why the UK has now spent hundreds of millions of pounds on not sending anyone to Rwanda, and just as a sideline, trashing our constitution. So I think to kind of conclude that Dublin hasn't worked or doesn't work, I think underestimates something that Brexit illustrates quite nicely, which is the need to have mechanisms across Europe to move people either to the first state in which they claim to sign, or more importantly, the big underserved to enable families to reunite. So that was one clause in the Dublin scheme. that you were able to enter jurisdictions where you had family members and therefore move. A very small number of people were able to move. The UK lost that ability too. So those people who were stuck in France and say my uncle or my brother is in the UK, they would have potentially been able to stay in the UK had they come in. Britain was a member of the EU. And so my final point, and this is probably the one that you foresaw, which was around offshore processing. So I think resettlement, yes, absolutely. I think many global north states can expand their resettlement programs. I think this is something that states like Canada and the US do very well, and that we in the UK and Europe do spectacularly badly. But resettlement schemes are not the same as dealing with asylum claims or processing. You say that properly managed, there's no reason why processing at reception centres could not work. And you say that what you're proposing is not a hotspot. But in what way is it not a hotspot? Because what you're describing is what is happening at the moment. People are detained in conditions and their claims are processed. And so I suppose my question here would be, is your detention centre nicer? How is that different from the policies that we have at the moment? Now, in terms of offshore processing, what this tends to refer to are states kind of subcontracting their obligations in relation to decision making, various different reasons. In the UK's case, it's deterrence, but there could be good reasons as well. So there's nothing in refugee law that precludes the possibility of this happening. The legal framework, however, requires any such agreement to enhance the protection space to it would have to be a system of responsibility sharing that enables more people to secure protection overall. And I don't see how the routes to offshore processing that you described can secure that outcome. And it's easy to say, well, I don't mean Rwanda, but the problem there is, and which states do, because the only states which will take these deals are the ones which the Council of Europe states will not be able to send people to. European Court of Human Rights has been fairly clear and robust thus far, and it has been tested effectively more recently. And I don't see states within the Council of Europe juridical space agreeing to these types of arrangements. We could barely agree on Dublin, which would be the kind of short version of it. So I think I would need to read more about offshore processing here and how that supports your arguments. The final thing I had was a question, which was about how you just introduced the piece of work and framed your argument. You started off by saying that you wanted, as far as possible, to understand the refugee crisis from the perspective of refugees. So there, I think there are two things. And one of them I would say is that do refugees, when you were speaking to them, do they want access to these kinds of short-term precarious, like labour migration routes that you identify, or do they want something different? And then a number of the responses that you delineate here and trace for us are more geared towards the European political community and policymakers, and I don't know if you did interview people there. And so what's the match between your encounters with refugees and the findings of your research? And do you in fact also need to speak to some of these policymakers to see if some of the things that you are suggesting from the perspective of the European political community will have the types of effects that you need?
Thank you very much, Catherine.
You should open the question, but I just want to clarify one quick issue, not because everything because I wasn't clear. The only type of offshore processing that I think is acceptable is expanded settlements off European shores. What I'm proposing, perhaps in a utopian way, is rescues at sea and processing at the first European country they reach, which is to say, Italy, Spain, Greece, and Portugal. So processing within the European Union. But yes, it would have to be a detention center. The problem with the hotspots is they're underfunded, they're overcrowded, and they're premised on a distribution across the EU that's not happening. What I would love to see is a grant of asylum that's respected across the EU, and that where people are allowed to go is linked much more to their language. It makes no sense to send French speakers to Germany where they struggle, as anyone knows who's not a native German speaker, to learn German, rather than to France, or where they have family members. So much more refugee agency respected after the grant of asylum.
Would you like to respond to any other?
No, because I've talked too much. I'll come back to Catherine's comments after.
Okay, that's appropriate, right? Yeah. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, Peter, Oxford Europe. Really just a couple of comments on what you said. Very wide ranging talk, thank you, very informative. I think I would agree entirely with most of what you've said. I
See, this was a very Oxford comment. I haven't taught in 20 years, but it always starts with, it was very interesting, I agree, and then something devastating is coming. So I'm nervous at the comment.
Well, no, I mean, but maybe what you're going to do was around it, because you said it was with the lie about Rwanda being a state country. But what I'm wondering about is that one of the most sinister aspects of it, even those who succeed in their claim for asylum or expected to stay in Rwanda, there's nothing said about what happens to those who don't succeed. And that seems to be completely at variance with refugee conventions and basic human decency. My other question about Rwanda was to do with the fact that indirectly it seems to have succeeded in doing one thing, which is in persuading people that it's sensible to move to Ireland. I'm Irish, and in that sense, it's succeeded from the government's point of view. You think of point of view, I use the word "same" with you, was my choice, but it just succeeded in offloading the problem on somebody else. Now the question is, was that part of the intention? Is the government thinking quite as explicit as to make it possible? That was found to be that 5 years ago, but now unfortunately that time is possible.
Yeah, an excellent question, and I'll take that just in the context of some comment that Captain made on Rwanda. So yes, I agree entirely that it's even more worrisome. But I said nothing about the people who's going to reject it and what will happen to them. Yes, I think this Conservative Party is cynical enough not to care, and empirically, yes, it seems to be having that deterrent effect. But this is precisely why one needs a cross-European, including Britain, response to the refugee crisis, because it becomes a race to the bottom if states compete, making life so miserable for refugees that we hope you can shut them somewhere else. And some of that is happening anyway, sending them on to Germany. On the comment on Rwanda, I agree with everything you said, and the threats coming from the states and not the far right. Well, I don't agree insofar as the far right is in power in the United Kingdom. It's called the Conservative Party. I mean, there's this self-congratulatory narrative that we've been escaped the far right in the United Kingdom because of the electoral system, which funds a small party. That's nominally true, but Braverman, Patel, sometimes Sunak, depending on the day he's in, would be very happy in the brothers or the reform Rassemblement National. So in a sense, I think Rwanda is what we will see if the far right comes to power in other European countries. It's there.
Interesting the names you mentioned, the second generation the names you mentioned, the UK politics, the Conservative Party, the second generation is
Yeah, well, and that's, I mean, that's clear, right? It's, in a sense, this government was an incredible, let's call it achievement or development. You had the most multiracial government in British history. And I think it's fair to say, correct me if I'm wrong, Sunak's unpopularity has nothing to do with the fact that he's of South Asian descent. I think he got there all by himself. Purely merit-based unpopularity. But what's unfortunate is that it seems to succeed in the Conservative Party. This is not through the Labour Party. You have to be more anti-immigrant and above all more anti-European than a mainstream member of the Conservative Party. It's another kind of Portillo effect. The moment that you're marginalized from the core of Englishness, you demonstrate your Englishness by embracing the most extremes. It's like Irish Americans who integrated through anti-Black racism. I think that's the kind of dynamic.
Yeah,
Yes.
just on your end, the agreement stated that people who are not recognised as refugees in Rwanda would be permitted to remain there. So under the scheme, if you were recognised as a refugee, you would be in Rwanda and would work, and if you were not, you would be in Rwanda.
What's the difference? Yeah, thanks very much. Excuse my courtesy. So, I guess I have a proverbial question and comment, and I think it's really forgot to kind of appreciate the comments as well. Towards the end of your presentation, you talked about the narrative, about
immigrants in general, but refugees and asylum seekers in particular. And I think that's where so much of the battle is, and where the battle has been lost. Because the narrative, the overwhelmingly successful narrative has been that non-citizens are dangerous, they're criminals, and feeds on fear and xenophobia. And the economic arguments just don't work. I mean, people have tried to make them for years.
Yeah.
Right? That, I agree with everything, in terms of the contributions that non-citizens make to economies. But when those arguments are put up against, the boatloads of invaders, they're just not going to pass muster, and certainly not with policymakers. And you're seeing, as you demonstrate, not working very well with public either. So how do you change that narrative? The only way, in talking to refugee lawyers from a variety of the countries that you identified, that I have seen suggested, is to focus on the individual, which you do at the beginning of your presentation. But how does that work on a large scale? And with policymakers, you're going to be the ones who have to adopt the measures that you're talking about. So that's first. The second thing is, on the one hand, you emphasize the need to process the claims, and that was in capital letters. But you also said that in a way it doesn't matter because people stay anyway. So is the solution maybe something, and this maybe what Catherine was getting to with the Ukrainian example? Maybe we shouldn't differentiate between folks who have valid refugee claims and those who are economic migrants. And of course, there's so much overlap between those two groups. That's kind of futile to try and distinguish, and particularly that's going to get more difficult to distinguish with climate refugees, with folks who are fleeing different forms of persecution because of climate change.
Yeah.
Are they classic refugees? Are they economic migrants? But anyway, are we just wasting our time trying to figure out if somebody's got a valid refugee claim when practically they're going to stay anyway? And we spend and all these efforts to regularize refugee processes in the EU have been unsuccessful. We still have tremendous variation in acceptance rates across countries within. So maybe, I mean, I'm not saying but I say we throw away the whole notion of asylum. I spent many years defending it in one way or the other.
You've got a foot that says otherwise.
But maybe thinking outside the box.
Yeah, no, and I guess got my job talk at Toronto making exactly that argument. You should give up in this statement, accept that will. So now I'm going to attack my earlier argument. It's the kind of John Gray approach to a career. You spend your career attacking things you said before. But I don't think we throw up our hands, because I think that really would concede the argument to the far right. So what do? Well, it's probably what I reckon. Try to recreate a perception of control by opening other channels, and not simply low scale. I also agree entirely. I think asylum seekers, refugees need to get into I had a slide on that, but believe it, I figured I need to get into the labor market as quickly as possible. When you speak to policymakers, I think Alex Leinkoff, who you probably know from UNHCR, said time and time again, I can reach even the most hardcore anti-migrant Republicans by saying these are refugees, and even they would accept that. This was the Republican Party 15 years ago, so perhaps it's a challenge now. But I think we would lose something if we gave up on that distinction. What we say to mainstream governments, what we say to centrist governments, right or left, the non-populists, is that it's in your interest. Only interest-based arguments work, altruist arguments. It's in your interest to defend immigration, because if you go down the road of conceding the arguments to the far right, the anti-immigration forces, they are going to win. Because if you have the choice between a true far right anti-immigrationist, anti-immigration politician, and someone who's kind of half-heartedly adopting that position on tactical grounds, you're going to lose the argument. So that would be my sort of responses to that. And my hope would be, once you have legal channels, and the US needs exactly the same thing, the asylum queues would be shorter, and countries of origins would be more receptive on return. And for my interviews, there's some evidence of that. We don't know.
Thank you very much. Could I take the opportunity of asking both of you 2 questions which are related but not directly on your talks, which have always puzzled me, and it's about what research is going on to do with migration. And the first question is, when the flight to Rwanda was introduced as a great scheme, the argument was that if potential migrants knew about Rwanda, this would put them off migrating. And it seemed to me a fanciful argument. But the question it raised in my mind was, is there any research going on how the traffickers, yes, presumably the traffickers, are managing their networks and how the communication system works across communities from which people want to immigrate? I mean, is there research going on there? And if so, how is that playing into policy? And the other question relates to the impact on societies from which migrants have left. How have the people in those societies been affected by the loss of often elites and clever and smart young entrepreneurial people? I remember being in Albania in 2001 and going to meetings, and all those who were smart, who were over 16, had left. And that really struck me as something very interesting and modern. So presumably the last lot came to Britain with the next generation up from 2001. I can see it's impossible to do that in countries that may still be growing, but the sort of policy in a way, I've always wondered what happens when you take away these elites, some of them, from certain societies and welcome them elsewhere. What is the impact, and what way is that playing into policy? Sorry, it's a long question.
And so on the Rwanda and evidence-based deterrence, there is no evidence that supports the idea that either Rwanda specifically or general policies along those lines generally will deter individuals from making the dangerous journeys to the UK or elsewhere. In fact, there is so little evidence of it that the government has been scrutinised by the Public Accounts Committee on this point, and the senior civil servant had to write a letter to explain that the legislation is being put forward, even though they didn't have a basis for the costings that have been put forward. That's also one of the main unprecedented things around this theme. In terms of research going on in countries where people have left, I'm afraid I don't think that's what I would refer to. In terms of research on traffickers, if we do know a little bit, so we know how they operate. We know, for example, that people make part payments in northern France and other countries, and then they pay again. And family members will pay when they safely arrive in the UK, that goes to money shops in various towns, that these are kind of transnational networks. I agree with the picture that you painted. I think that you summarise the research on this. I think one thing I would highlight is that in terms of the people on the boats, the person steering the boat is normally themselves a refugee.
Yeah.
So when we talk about traffickers, we're talking about individuals who are very loosely making arrangements. I would also be very pedantic and say that we're not, in a lot of cases, talking about trafficking at all. Trafficking refers to the movement of people by certain means for the purposes of exploitation. So some of the scenarios that you discussed would be trafficking. The majority of the things we're actually talking about is smuggling, which is regulated in a very different way. But of course, smuggling doesn't have quite the same pull politically as trafficking, and so anti-trafficking rhetoric is often used, and states will take measures to suppress mobility under the guise of responding to trafficking and transnational organised crime, which actually have very significant negative consequences for refugees, making it harder for them to access jurisdictions which are safe and contain them in Libya, as you described, in situations which are distinctly unsafe. So I think if we have research on all of those things, and I think some policy responses, if we wanted evidence-based policy responses to it, are exactly the things that Randall outlined, which is family reunion routes, enabling people to travel legally in a variety of different ways, including to access protection.
If I can just follow up, the communications between these different routes, do they exist? Are they on the dark web or how?
No, mostly it's just WhatsApp.
Nobody else.
No, WhatsApp.
No. Go back.
It's just the WhatsApp
First of all,
is encrypted. So WhatsApp is encrypted, and there are other modes, kind of very similar things that you can do, which just delete when the message is received. These are not technologically sophisticated organizations. It's money shops and phones. There's nothing else to it.
No, I think I agree 100% with that. And the problem, smuggling, trafficking, very close distinction. I didn't think it essential. The network is so large and so massive that even you have to break it down to see what you're talking about. Sometimes smugglers become traffickers when they come out of money. People move from country to country, earning money to pay traffickers to move to another. People are obsessed with sex trafficking and spread a small minority of trafficking. 85% of it is trafficking for labor. Sometimes it's the only community. Ethiopians in South Africa bring over other Ethiopians and have them work in spaza shops, small convenience stores for very little amounts of money. The only thing I'd add to that is it is a market and it's driven by the laws of economics. So when we crack down on it, the other thing I didn't mention, we don't do is stop it. We just raise the price. So we make trafficking in the sense of debt bondage, exploitation, forced labor, be it sexual or traditional labor, we make it more likely. I'm not a fan of open borders, but if you really wanted to end smuggling and trafficking definitively, open borders would do it, which I'm not going to do.
Randall, very much looking forward to the book. It's going to be important, and thanks for a great comment, Captain. Two questions to Randall around that. Theoretically, it seems to me that a refugee who has a well-founded fear of persecution and someone who has a well-founded fear of starvation are rather hard to distinguish. But the factual question to you, Randall, is when you talk about the mainly, I think, young men on the boats, they're not people having a well-founded fear of starvation, right? It's where the family have got together to get one family member to come to a richer country and send money back. So they are, in your definition, economic migrants. That's factual question number one. Germany, I want to challenge you a bit because you give a very positive account of the German experience. But of course, as you very well know, 2015-16 is the moment at which the AfD vote goes through the roof. Initially an anti-Euro party, suddenly makes it big precisely on this issue, and today the AfD is ahead of both the Social Democrats and the Greens in national opinion polling, and 35, 36, 37% in the East of November. So could you comment on how, even if it got the policy, why Germany has got the politics wrong? Because otherwise the party which even Marine Le Pen considers too extreme to be a partner would not be at that place in the opinion polls. Catherine, what you said about Frontex, legal lacuna of impunity, say a bit more. How can it be that what is soon going to be, I think, the largest agency of the EU, which we all know is meant to be a community of law, is operating in a grey zone of legal impunity? That sounds extraordinary.
You go first.
So how can it be? I'm going to say design. So the problem relates to jurisdiction. The Frontex operations are carried out, but in a combination of people who are directly employed by the European Union itself, and by almost relationships that involve subcontracting with people who work in border posts of member states. So when pushbacks, for example, occur in different contexts, it's unclear whether the people responsible to it, their actions can be attributed to the EU as an institution, to member states, or to both. And legal attempts to unpick this, and presenting it very simply, have all failed. And they've all failed with the Court of Justice of the European Union, which again indicates to me that this is design. Cases before the European Court of Human Rights have been slightly more successful. In terms of characterizing some of the deaths that result from those interactions as being unlawful and a violation of the prohibition of them. But what we have not yet done in European Union law is to be able to drill down measures of legal responsibility to individuals on boats, which would be the first step, but also to policies that result in people. And I've only just started engaging with the pact, you'll obviously be further in this, but I don't think anything in it changes these relationships. Interestingly, the way that Frontex has been challenged is through EU administrative law procedures related to, for example, the Court of Auditors. It's not something I've ever had to engage with or read too much about. But their internal EU processes for looking at where money ends up and how those processes of spending are scrutinized seems to have been the most fruitful way of calling attention to some of these policies and consequences, which tells you quite a lot, I think, about the EU political and legal community.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Two very interesting comments. That's broadly right, and I almost hesitate to agree in the sense refugee, a claim is an individual claim, so any one of those folks, like could be an LGBTQ person, Keezy from Mali, this is a country that produces huge numbers of refugees, he came to, but in the aggregate, the majority are young men seeking opportunities for home resources have been put together often by the community or earned along the way. And many of those who I talk to will return migrants. What often happens is they run out of money or exploited in Libya if they made it to Algeria and then dumped back in Niger with terrible conditions to an island detention center that's often overflowing and eventually make it back. But yes, it's broadly a story about migration. I mean, in an ideal world, again, the EU would admit everyone, but as Margaret Wiener said 40 years ago, admission to rich countries is like admission to elite universities. See, supply policy needs to be constructed as human as possible. Germany, yes. I think perhaps I was a bit gooey-eyed about that. Partly I did think what the Germans did was incredible. Partly I think they did wisely recognize that we're not an open water cannons on women and children and yes, young men as they reach the German border. But the reason the alternative for Germany did so well is it was a classic loss of control. Probably should have been predicted more than it was, but there was no greater movement when the Germans basically gave up. And I think that explains why the alternative for Germany did so well. So I would link that to my recommendation of maintaining a perception of control. Because when you have that, I mean, Germany takes the height of the Euro crisis. I know you were very critical of Germany's response, but Germany was taking 800,000 Southern Europeans a year with not a blip. You had to, in my street, your old street in Berlin, you had to speak Spanish or English if you wanted to order a drink. German would get you nowhere. Also, the whole story of the far right, where I agree with you that it's not all about immigration, it's about the collapse of the party system and above all of the communist and social democratic left. And when it implodes, the far right shows up. And whilst I was a great fan when he came to power, I was guilty wrong. Emmanuel Macron, his deliberate destruction of the party system is making Le Pen almost an inevitability because he wants a two-party contest, thinking that the Macronists will always win and eventually they won't. And in Germany, I think what's going on at the moment isn't just high refugee numbers. They're not high, but they're manageable. It's we talked about this earlier. It's Schulz's utterly incompetent governance of the coalition and the decline of the Social Democrats. As many votes go from the left, and particularly the far left, to the far right, that's the center right. So that's it.
Can I just use my position with the chair with a couple of questions and comments? One thing I was wondering is whether we could de-EUize the whole picture in the sense that the term dreaming of Europe is intensifies that kind of perception of we have in Europe that everybody from the rest of the world wants to come to Europe because it's the paradise. And when you show your percentages there, it's actually 25% that comes here. So if we make this much more relative, there are many other destination states, right? For instance, we see how the Turkish government manages to hold the refugees whenever it likes. And we don't even know whether those 4 million that are in Turkey, they really want to go to Europe. So I suppose, that is a kind of a question that maybe you could put to your informants as to whether they really want to come to Europe and what is their real purpose. The other thing that I would like to say is also that the agreements and the outsourcing of this policy of migration to the border states of Europe, rather the outside the border states, has many kind of implications in terms of how they collaborate with authoritarian regimes, how much do they strengthen these regimes. There's been a whole argument about how Erdogan gained from this kind of process, but not just they consider this to be a very successful one, they emulated with Tunisia, with Egypt. And that is an issue of human rights as well, and an issue of how do you kind of give power to authoritarian regimes. I mean, the latest Egyptian one is a particularly significant agreement. And just to say a very quick point on the role of Germany, I think it's not just about the fact that Germany is receiving many more economic migrants and refugees than other European states. It's also maybe is much more effective in the way that it uses its own funds to those countries that they give assistance to keep the refugees there. So, for instance, that they have a very good plan of educating people in Egypt, those migrants who come from other places, eventually to bring them to Germany. So there's a much more strategic kind of plan from the side of Germany that other countries don't really share.
Okay, yeah, I mean, very, very interesting. Now, I should just pick up on one question that you had on rendering rather crude what you said, but viewing the boats as either a problem or just a refugee force, a labor force in waiting. And I see that sort of criticism, not from the perspective of refugees, but what they can do for the states. And my main hope is just to get people off the bloody boats. The boats are just a terrible idea. Not because these traffickers are the cause of it all, but because people are dying. 44,000 people died in the Mediterranean. It's not directly comparable. I know it's deliberately brought up, but there are tents down the street because 32,000 Palestinians have died, and that is a horror. But 44,000 people died, and we are not responsible for the Palestinian. Well, I wouldn't say that. But we are more directly responsible. We are more directly responsible for those deaths in the Mediterranean. We don't see the same level of outrage. Sorry, I'm fading. The Turkish deal, supporting dictatorships. There was something else you said though.
And the way that Germany
Oh, okay. Yeah,
allocated.
the last one I'll have to look into more. I don't know the answer on that, perhaps others do. Yes, one is entering in, I mean, it's partly foreign policy. You deal, Saudi Arabia is an important ally in foreign policy. You deal with some pretty nasty creatures, and that's unavoidable. My hope is that if other policies are implemented, which I'm discussing here, incidentally, I'm not overly optimistic that any of this will happen, but if it does happen, then I'm hoping one will mean fewer of those deals. But when I look back to 2016, if I were Angela Merkel, 1 million people had entered the country, more were coming. She was about to lose power. The far right was completely going through the roof. I can't really say if I were advising her, people like Altmaier, who did advise her, are very decent people, that I would have said, no, you cannot do this. I'm not sure she had very much choice. So we won't ever get rid of a world of fences, the dirty deals, and the externalization. I just hope we can reduce all of that. As much as we can. Yes.
At the back.
Hi, Randall. I know maybe it's a hard kind of what's in our meeting debates. But one thing that's quite striking now with Catholic economics is the way housing is affected immigration for immigration.
Yeah.
Very might change. So just one thing that speaks to how that affects European law.
Yeah, what is interesting about that, to answer, I can answer that on the Canadian angle, is I was always amazed that year after year, the country took in, Margaret, if my figure's wrong, about 300,000 people, I think 100,000 would end up in the greater Toronto area. And there was this constant complaint about housing prices, and no one connected the two. I thought this is very odd, that there's no, of course, 100,000 people move to a city. And new Canadians don't want to live in a condo downtown. It's the North American dream. They want a big house with a garden in the suburbs. These people like Margaret and me who live in moldy houses in the center because I think we're terribly hip immigrants want space. And that connection has sort of been made. But what's interesting about that is that because, I'll give you my little speech on this. Canadian national identity is about not being American, otherwise there's really no point in the country. So Canadians get up every day and say, how can I not be American when there's 24 hours? And there's not much they can do. They walk, talk, act, and seem like Americans. What they have is multiculturalism. The Americans are assimilationists, Canadians are multicultural, which is actually completely nonsense. Canadians are more assimilationist in practice than Americans. Since multiculturalism is the basis of national identity, it's hard to be opposed to immigration because the two are linked. That's why immigration is popular. And what do you do when you can't point to the obvious culprit? Well, then you need an alternative. Before World War II, it was always the Jews. In parts of Africa, it's LGBTQ people. What did the Canadians do? They began blaming foreign students. They're the fault. And the number of them is just utterly trivial, and they all live in little dorms anyway. So I'm frankly surprised that connection wasn't made. But anywhere, Canada or Europe, the crisis of housing has relatively little to do with immigration and everything to do with the fact that the state has withdrawn from this sector. My colleague, Alex Reisenbichler at the University of Toronto, a guy from Leipzig, works on this. And he's shown definitively where you have affordable middle-class housing is where the state builds lots of it. And the state has just stopped doing that. And these movements of students or refugees or even immigrants are too small. So that's my opinion. I don't. Sure.
Well, I think the association actually is much stronger. Only it's like half of them there is going to be much stronger.
Then immigration pushes up housing costs.
Yeah, and I think that not necessarily like the only foreign students are part of that, but I think association is much stronger.
Have you seen any studies of that?
All studies are just like an anecdotal what I've seen from here.
Yeah. I don't know. Berlin's housing crisis was mostly caused by internal migration. The Berlin economy turning around and Germans moving there en masse. But I haven't seen the evidence either. My intuition is that the migrants play a small role. But I'll have to look into it further. It's a question.
Can we take three now, because I've seen three hands?
Yeah.
Let's do it, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the presentation. My name is Mata. I come from South Sudan, but I study in Scotland. My question is about climate refugee. To what extent is it a threat to you? And in the context of the discussion of Rwanda, what are your perspectives when you talk about climate change and how it is being securitized in you, particularly in the UK? Country might come in with your some ideas around the same.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well,
thank you. I just want to return to the issue of narrative. And I think at the very end, you talked about the collapse of the left as being a sense part of this, but there are a number of other groups that are also competing for that particular story, right? NGOs, the churches, and you can argue in the last 20 years, the Vatican maybe actually at times, the most kind of leftist, most sympathetic.
Well, since Francis.
What?
Since Francis.
Since Francis, yes, that's right, in Berger recently. So it's one in which, why do you think they're so weak and they can't seem to move the needle on this story? Because what you described is that the only game in town is one of states and right-wing parties. But there was a time in which this is much more of a kind of open contest. And in which you had a whole spectrum from hostility to sympathy, and that, on the kind of sympathy part of the spectrum, it seems to have dropped off, which is that the collapse of the left is certainly part of that story, but there's something else, right? In terms of what has happened to a lot of these NGOs, the kind of more progressive church position, what do you think, the kind of humanitarian sensibility that you did have, let's say, in the 1990s, with the role of the kind of rebooting United Nations. That seems to collapse any sense of what you think is reasonable.
Yeah.
A very short question. Do you, in your book, do you plan to cover also this quite new situation with the weaponization of the migration, the Polish-Russian border? Today morning, the Polish order was stopped by one of the migrant, and of course it's creating a lot of, again, debates and the way, we should respond to the situation, and we all, because it's how this was organized, where this pressure is coming from, and so on, but it's quite, I think, new phenomenon, at least in the modern history.
Yeah. I'll take those questions, Rosa. The answer is no. This is migration diplomacy. There's an emerging literature on Hansen in London, where it's on. I've got a PhD student who's working on exactly that topic. Gaddafi did this for years. Libya did this for years. In a European regional context, it's fairly new, but otherwise, it's fairly old. I mean, Turkey was doing constant. We don't have another €1 billion. We're going to open the floodgates. But yeah, so not directly in this project. I say I do have a student working on it. Yeah, I always get accused of focusing too much on the state, and we've done it again. No, the NGO civil society do matter. One of the reasons when Maloney came to power, which was horrifying to me, I was slightly reassured, because Italy has this incredibly robust civil society. And the Vatican gets lots of things wrong, like sexuality, but on this issue, this Pope has just been excellent. I mean, I always say to we'll leave that. So it does play a role, and in fact, my detention proposal, humane detention, people in Italy have said to me, you can't actually have this because the Vatican would never tolerate it, and their word on this is so strong that we will not detain. Germany, the horrendous rapes and sexual assaults of Cologne in 2016, right? 2016. That changed the national narrative. It didn't end the welcoming culture. So all those groups volunteering, and they turned up again at Hauptbahnhof in Berlin. People were saying, family with 2 children, we need someone who speaks French, and Germans were putting up against. That is still there. They're being drowned out by the loudest voices. Some people optimistically say the loudest voices are the most influential, but when we look at party support, it is working. But no, fair comment. On your point on climate refugees, this is where I'm always a bit pedantic. There's no such thing as a climate refugee, because the climate does many things, but it does not persecute. You cannot have a well-founded fear of persecution from the climate. Even if it feels like that in the January in Oxford or Toronto, you are not being persecuted. But I'm being pedantic. The burden of your question was climate-driven migration. It is going to be there. All the estimates you see, these confident predictions of 150, 200 million, ignore them. These people have no idea what they're talking about. All they're doing is mapping predicted climate changes onto existing populations and extrapolating movements from that. There's going to be a huge number of intervening variables, the most important of which is what sort of state capacity is there. So there was climate change in northern Alberta, massive forest fires, but thousands, tens of thousands of people were evacuated because of state capacity. That's going to matter hugely. And like all migrants, the vast majority of them will be internal. Haida Hass in this book, what's it called? 20 Myths of Migration or something like that, a Mythbuster. He makes the point that flooded areas have richer soil nutrients. So in fact, his prediction, I'm not sure if it's right, is that people are going to move towards the floods rather than away from them. I wouldn't go that far, but does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay.
Okay, I think we're done. Not everybody asked a question and a comment, so thank you very much, Randall. It's been excellent. And Catherine, for your great points, and thank you for coming with congratulations on what you're writing now and when it's published.
Well, thanks.
Well done.
You're good.
No, I didn't ask a question. Well. Yeah.